Okay. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. I'm truly honored every one of you is here. I've been working really hard on this message. And before I get started, I want to tell you a little bit about me. So I just want to first point out my beautiful family. They're back in the cry room. You can't see them. My wife, Ashley, my two sons, Cain and Jonah, have really sacrificed a lot for me to put this on. It's been a lot of time away from them. So I just want to give them a thanks right up front, because also they're actually one of the probably the biggest reason I'm here tonight. I was raised a Christian. I was raised in the Catholic Church, and I grew up believing in God. I grew up loving God, but I always grew up with a lot of questions. There was a lot of things in my life that I always felt, I struggled with, and I always felt like, my faith didn't necessarily give me the answers I needed. And so as I got older, I left my parents' house. My faith kind of stayed behind. And so I wasn't necessarily a practicing Christian when I met my wife, but she was, thankfully. She brought me to this church, and I made a lot of progress with her as we led up to our marriage, but I got stuck. And I think there's probably some of you out there tonight that can relate to that. You see, I got far enough that I felt like I was okay, right? I felt like I was doing pretty good, and I didn't necessarily need to take any more steps. That was, in hindsight, probably a terrible conclusion to come to, because I've come so far since then, and I have still so much farther to go. And fortunately, the thing that kind of got me unstuck was the birth of my oldest son. You see, for me, being a father really woke me up to the fact that I wasn't the best person I could be. And it was only when I was holding my son in the hospital, my wife, so being our first child, and many of you can relate, my wife insisted that we did not sleep at the same time. One of us had to be awake to watch the baby. Fortunately, she's gotten over that since. Otherwise, I don't know that I'd be here. But, she insisted, and she was exhausted. She had just gone through labor all day. So I took the first watch. And it was a very surreal experience holding this little boy that I realize now I had responsibility for. And, that was the moment that I realized, that I needed to be a better man than I was. And not to say I wasn't a good man, but I wasn't the man I needed to be. I just really saw that in that moment. And so a few months went by. We decided to get my son dedicated here in the church, Three Angels Church. And I decided to tell the pastor that I was ready to be baptized in this church as well, which is the step I had always stopped short of. A very good friend of mine, Pastor McCombs, had worked so hard to get me to that point. Sorry. And, I owe him a lot of credit for that, but he could never get me over that hump. And so it was good for me to get past that, and I owe him a lot for the time he spent with me. And so I began serving in the church a little bit. It all went pretty fast from there. Not long after that, I was teaching Sabbath school here in the church, so I was teaching our weekly lessons. Not long after that, I was preaching, and after I got a few sermons under my belt, much to my surprise, I was asked to become an elder here in the church, which is how I got here tonight. Our pastor challenged us as elders to take this on. And it's a daunting task if you're not trained to be a pastor, not trained to be a theologian. It's a daunting task anyway, but when it's not your day job, right, when it's not what you do, it just seems like so much bigger. And so here I am in front of you. And as I was trying to meditate on what this week's message was going to be, I started reviewing some of my old material, and I realized there was a theme there. There was a theme that I hadn't even really intended for it to be there, but it was always there. And so I knew that God was talking to me, right? And that theme was really trying to reveal God's true character, trying to debunk some of these myths we all learn about God, and that was always my struggle. So that's why I always gravitated towards that issue. So as I began to study this issue, I discovered that somebody had done a much better job than I could have ever hoped to do in kind of laying this out. It's a man by Dr. Tim Jennings. He's a psychiatrist, and he's a Seventh-day Adventist as well. And it was just funny how God works. I was teaching a Sabbath school lesson one morning, and a man came. He was a visitor. I don't see him often. I couldn't even tell you his name. I could recognize him if I saw him. But I said something to him in that lesson that struck a chord with him, and he just wrote down a URL on a piece of paper. It was comeandreason.com. And that was Dr. Tim Jennings' site. So he has weekly Sabbath school lessons. And at first, I didn't really connect with his message. I spent a lot of time kind of going back and forth, different sources as I prepared my Sabbath school lessons. But the more I got to hear his words, the more I realized, we kind of had a similar thread in the things we would say. And so I went directly to him when I was trying to put this stuff together. He's written a couple of books, which I'll reference heavily throughout the week. But I just wanted to bring that up because I want to give credit where it's due. A lot of this stuff is very much inspired by his work. He did a much better job than I could have saying the things I want to say and kind of doing the upfront groundwork research. And so with that out of the way, let's get into the real meat of the message. And what I want to talk about first is kind of the state of the world as far as being a Christian. You see, for me, this week was a bit eye-opening because as I was leading up to it, I realized how much I struggled sharing my faith with other people. People who go to church with me know that I'm faithful, that I believe in God. They know what I believe. But once I leave this building, I didn't talk about that very much. Not at work, not to people at the barbershop, not to people I played softball with. None of those people really knew the faith I had. And that was unfortunate. And I started to wonder why that is. And I started to kind of think about this, and this was actually a theme that led to my first sermon was, it's a little unfashionable to be a Christian these days. Anybody agree with that? I think if you really look at what the world thinks of Christians, we don't have a great reputation, at least not as good as it used to be, right? And I think a lot of people kind of struggle with this issue. It's very hard to kind of come out and say, I'm a Christian, I believe in Christ, because you kind of have this fear of rejection, right? Maybe I'm going to talk to you. Maybe, that guy's going to try to convert me. I don't want to hear what he's got to say, right? Which is ironic, right? We kind of got this fear of being judged, but oftentimes Christians are viewed as judgmental. It seems like, there's this kind of general attitude of, it's cool if you're a Christian. I just don't want to talk about it, right? And so it's interesting to contrast that with other things, right? I used to work out at a CrossFit gym. I don't know how many of you know what CrossFit is, but if any of you have ever met somebody who does CrossFit, that's all they talk about, right? Literally, that's all they talk about. So I used to work at this gym. I was one of the cults, right? I talked about it all day. I don't work out there anymore just for various reasons, mostly time. But my wife still goes there, and I'm friends with a lot of those people. Hey, you ever walk into that gym, that's all they're talking about. What PRs and what's the WOD today and reps and sets, and that's all they talk about. And they will drive every conversation to CrossFit. Now, you could be talking about your dog. All of a sudden, you're talking about CrossFit 5 minutes later. You don't know how you got there, but that's what it is, right? And I was wondering, why isn't that the case with Christians, right? Why don't we do that with our faith? Because, it's a perfectly acceptable thing to talk about, right? But we just don't have that zeal for it most of the time, right? Or if we do, we're almost ostracized for it. We're almost penalized for it. And so I started to really kind of think about this. Why is that the case? Why do people not really want to hear about Jesus Christ? And I realized maybe it's because we don't have a great reputation, right? And so I started digging some stats, and some of these are from my very first sermon, right? And the first one I came across was 16% of people 16 to 29 years old, so 16 to 29-year-olds, 16% of them say they have a good impression of Christianity. only 16%. This is the future, right? 16 to 29-year-olds, this is the future. Only 16%. That means 84% don't have a good impression of Christianity. And this is a little bit old material. It might be like somewhere between 5 and 7 years old. So it made a comment that said a decade before, that was actually exact opposite. A majority of people had a good view of Christianity. So we've come a long way, right, in the wrong direction. 23% of young Christians today, young non-Christians, I apologize, 23% of young non-Christians, so these are young people that don't identify as being Christian, say Christianity no longer looks like Jesus. So basically in their view, from what they understand about Jesus, Christianity doesn't reflect that at all, right? 23%, so 1 in 4. But here's the more impressive stat, or maybe more troubling stat, is that 22% of young Christians say the same thing, right? So our young Christians believe exactly as our young non-Christians, right? You were born and raised in this church, likely, and you do not believe that the church looks like Jesus. That's a problem, right? Another study had just on negative perceptions of among non-Christians of Christians, right? 87% say Christians are judgmental, right? 85% say they're hypocritical. 78% say they're old-fashioned. We're old school, right? We like to do things a different way. 75% say they're too involved in politics. I'm not sure why that's a negative thing, but I guess in this country it could be. Mostly because you don't really have any good options when you vote, right? But anyway, it's kind of startling that people don't really have a good view of Christians, right? And the study kind of went on. It talks about this issue of homosexuality, and it says, a lot of Christians were believed to show excessive contempt and unloving attitudes towards gays and lesbians, right? And young Christians largely criticized the church, saying it has made homosexuality a bigger sin than anything else, and that the church has not helped them apply the biblical teaching on homosexuality to their friendships with gays and lesbians. So that what our young people are saying is, you know what? You're not giving me the tools I need to deal with this issue, right? And it's an issue, right? We know that there are homosexuality is more accepted today than it's ever been in my life, right? And so it is an issue, and how do we deal with that, right? As a church, as a Christian faith, how would Jesus deal with that, I guess, is really the question. And I would say there's probably some truth to that view, right? Because I would ask you, how many of you know a couple that's shacking up? Anybody know what that means? Like a couple, they're not married, they're living together, right? And I know some, and great friends of mine, love them to death. I would do anything for them. I believe they're God-fearing people. I was once one of those people, right? And so how do we treat those people, right? We treat them just like everybody else. We may want to have a talk with them and say, hey, you guys should really consider getting married. But we don't treat them poorly, right? We don't picket in front of their house with signs and say they're an abomination. We don't do a lot of things that homosexual people have to deal with, right? And, ask yourself now, if you knew a married gay couple, how would you treat them? Would you treat them different than you would treat a straight couple that's shacking up, right? Because according to the Bible, those are both sins, right? But for some reason, as Christians, they're different, and we treat people differently based on those things. And why is that? Why do we treat one sinful couple with love and another perceived sinful couple not with love, right? And you start to wonder, what's going on here? How come we're not consistent, right? And so then I thought, okay, well, Christians aren't really viewed that well, but what about God, right? God has to be viewed well, right? So what are some words you would use to describe God? And we'll start with the positive ones, right? Loving, merciful, powerful, forgiving, all-knowing, wise, right? These are words that we might use to describe God, but there's a whole bunch of other words, as we kind of just discovered when people describe Christians. Some of those words get applied to God as well, right? Judgmental, vengeful, petty, dictator, authoritarian, right? There's a lot of people that view God this way, right? And here's the thing. So there's a study, I think it was in 2006, and Dr. Jennings is the one who I found it in one of his books, but it's from Baylor, and they just did a national survey on how people viewed God, right? Only 23% of those people surveyed viewed him as benevolent or loving, right? So it's starting to match a little bit, right? Christians are viewed a certain way. God is viewed very similar, according to the statistics, right? 32% saw him as authoritarian, right? 16% saw him as critical, and 24% saw him as distant. So that meant like he just wasn't really involved. He was just kind of letting things play out, right? And so you might look at these stats and be like, yeah, okay, big deal. So a lot of people don't really understand God. Well, here's the troubling statistic again. Only 5% of those people claim to be atheist. That means all of the people that were answering these questions and saying they believed God to not be loving, because only 23% said he was, that meant, what is it, 70, I'm bad at math right now, 77% said he wasn't, right? 77% said he wasn't. Those were all Christians, because only 5% of them said they were atheist, right? So the rest of them, that huge block of people that did not believe God was loving, were Christians. That's eye-opening to me. Why is that? Why is that only 1 in 4 Christians actually believe God is loving and benevolent, and we're trying to convert the world? We don't even believe the message ourselves. How are we doing this? What's going on? And so some Christians might say, why does this matter, right? Why do I care? Why do I care what the world thinks about me, right? I believe in God. I have my faith. If God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. Nobody said being a Christian was going to be easy. Nobody said people were going to like me, right? It's okay if they don't like me. Those are all true statements. They are. But what I want to talk to you tonight about is that what we believe matters. That's the theme this whole week. What we believe truly does matter. It's going to impact not only us, but the view people have of us. Not only our health, but our relationship with God. And if those things aren't right, how can we ever hope to minister to the world? How can we ever hope to evangelize as Christians? You know, we have people here tonight that want to hear the word of God that maybe haven't been in a church in a while, maybe never have been in a church. Maybe they're not even sure they believe in God, right? And if we have this message that God isn't loving, and those people are on the fence, well, that'd be enough to push me on the other side, right? And so I'm going to hope, I'm looking for 2 groups of people this week, right? I'm looking for 2 groups of people. I'm looking for people who don't believe in God because they believe a bunch of things about him that aren't true. And we're going to talk about those things this week. I'm also looking for people who are Christians, who believe a bunch of things about God that aren't true, but still believe in God anyway, and think that it's okay that they don't understand the truth as long as they have faith. Because both of those people are in trouble for the exact same reason. And so let's start with this. Have you ever heard of a placebo? Anybody know what a placebo is? It's like a fake pill, right? So a lot of times when doctors are studying medicine, they take this random group of people that need this medicine, they split them into 2, right? And they give one group the real medicine, and they give the other group the fake medicine, the placebo, right? And the reason they do this is because people actually are known to respond to pills that don't have any medication in them. It is just the thought that the pill might help them that actually makes them better, right? This is a placebo effect, right? So, and I'm guilty of this. I've fallen victim to this many times, right? Where I give you a pill and say, here, this will help your headache, right? All right, thanks. Hey, my headache's great. It's gone, right? And the pill was nothing, right? It was like water, right? It had nothing in it, right? This happens, right? This is a scientific fact. That's why doctors have to do this when they study medicine, right? Well, there's a lesser known effect that's very similar. It's called the nocebo effect, right? So it's where instead of getting positive effects from this medication, this fake medication, you actually get negative effects, right? So I might give you a pill and say, this is poison, right? And you eat it. Now things start to happen, right? The pill didn't really have any poison in it, but you start to react as if it did, right? So there's two things that you can talk about. And so the bottom line with this is what you put in your body may not really affect you as much as what's been put in your mind, right? And so there was a case study I found. There was an individual who was part of one of these studies. He was part of a study of an antidepressant medication. So this is a depressed individual, right? So normally they let people sign up for these studies that have a condition that the medicine can help, but they don't always get the medicine. So this was one of the guys that was in the placebo group. He didn't really get the medicine, right? He had the fake pill. And so one day he was having a bad day, and of course he's depressed already. He decided he wanted to take his life. So he took 29 of these placebo pills, which are nothing, right? Within the hour, he was in the hospital. He had hypertension. They had to put IVs in him just to maintain his fluid so that he could get the right blood pressure. And the doctors are freaking out. They don't know what to do with this guy. Everything they try isn't working. So finally, they get the doctor who's studying the medicine on the phone and they say, hey, you got to tell me what's in this stuff. This guy just OD'd on it and he's about to die. Well, the doctor says, well, he's in the placebo group. He says, what? So they go back to the hospital room where the guy's presumably dying, and they tell him, hey, man, you don't really have any medicine in you. You're just in the placebo group. Within half an hour, all his symptoms went away, right? This is a real study. This isn't, urban legend. This is something that happened. It's medically documented, right? Another one, this one's probably less well documented, but a lot more well known. You can find this on the internet. It's a man named Sam Schumann. This was like in 1970, maybe somewhere in the 70s. Sam Schumann was diagnosed with liver cancer. And when Sam Schumann was diagnosed with liver cancer, they diagnosed him with end-stage liver cancer. So they said, you got a few months to live. So Sam went home, depressed, dejected, and he lived out his 3 months. It was whatever the doctor said it was almost to the day. Sam died. And so after Sam died, they sent him to the coroner. They performed the autopsy, and it turns out the doctors were wrong. Sam didn't actually have cancer. He had a tumor, but it hadn't spread, and it wasn't very large. So in effect, Sam didn't die of cancer. He didn't actually really have cancer. He died of believing he had cancer, which is amazing to me that somebody could believe something so well that it actually takes their life, right? And so when I say that beliefs matter, I hope now you're starting to get the point. Because what we're believing will physically affect our bodies, our minds and our bodies, how they react, right? There's a few more studies that I got from some of Dr. Jennings' material. One was like a health shake, right? So they took this random group of people that were interested in losing weight, okay, and they gave them both the same shake, same amount of calories, same serving, right? But they told one group, you're getting this fatty, delicious, sugar-filled shake. It's like a weight gainer for bodybuilders, right? And they told this other group, you're getting a health shake. This is going to feed you, but it doesn't have any calories. You're just going to make you feel full, right? Both groups got the same shake, right? Well, guess what? The group that was told they had the fatty shake got fat. The group that told they had the skinny shake stayed the same, right? Their bodies impacted how they were absorbing this shake, all based on their mind. I could go on. I'll skip let me do one more. I got a few more. Excuse me. Some professors want to do another psychology test. I think they went to Asia, and they got a random group of Asian women. Broke them into two groups. They told one group of women that normally women don't do as well as men on math tests. And then they didn't tell anything to the other group. Gave them both the exact same math test, and sure enough, the women that were told that they don't do as well on math tests as men didn't do as well as the other group on the math test, right? They took the same group of women, shuffled them up again, but this time they told one group, Asian people normally do better on math tests than non-Asian people. They didn't tell the other group anything, gave them both the same math test, different math test I would hope, and then sure enough, the group that was told that Asian women do better on math tests actually did better, right? So whatever you believe going into something is going to impact you significantly, right? And to make this more relevant to what we're talking about tonight, there was a man named Dr. Newberg. Again, this is from one of the books I read from Dr. Jennings. He wanted to do the study on how meditating on different concepts about God affected your brain. So this is like he's like a neurologist or a psychiatrist or something. Excuse me. And so what he did was he had multiple different groups meditate like for 12 minutes on different attributes of God or different thoughts about God. So one group meditated on God being angry or vengeful. Another group on God being distant and not present. Another group on God being loving and benevolent, right? And he had maybe a few more. But what he found was, in all cases, and maybe I'll just read it, Dr. Newberg at the University of Pennsylvania has documented that all forms of contemplative meditation were associated with positive brain changes. So just meditating on God in general, actually, he can measure things in your brain that were positive, right? But the greatest improvements occurred when participants meditated specifically on a God of love, right? So if they meditated on God being loving and benevolent, their brain actually improved. He could measure things in their brain that really improved. And said such meditation was associated with the prefrontal cortex. That's the front part of your brain. That's really where you do all your thinking, logic, reasoning. It's the part of the teenager's brain that actually isn't developed that makes them make dumb choices, right? This is the part of the brain we need, right? That needs to be in tune with God. And he said subsequent. Let me see there. Let me find my place. Okay. And so the meditating on God of love was the greatest one. Subsequently, it increased the capacity for empathy, sympathy, compassion, and altruism. So these are all things that Christians would strive for in their life, right? Sympathy, being more sympathetic, being more empathetic, right? Being more compassionate, being more giving, right? Altruism. But here's the most astonishing part that he found. So not only does this other-centered love God increase when we worship. Basically, we're not just more giving people. We're not softer people, as some would like to say, right? But, and let me find it so I don't mess it up. When we worship a God of love, sharp thinking and memory improve as well, right? So what he found was when he measured these people that were meditating on a God of love, they became better givers. They became better friends, husbands, wives, whatever the case may be. They became better people in the sense of their ability to relate to other people. But not only that, they also became better thinkers, right? Which, if you read Dr. Jennings' book, his whole case is that if we are in line with God, our brains are working the way they're designed, and they're going to work a lot better than when they're not working as designed, right? It's like putting the wrong kind of gas. Put diesel in your car, what's going to happen? It's not going to run very well, right? A lot of us are running on diesel. So, that's kind of his point. But the bigger point, I think, is that I hope you guys are starting to see now that what we believe is truly impacting us right now, right? There is some belief all of you have that isn't true that is impacting you somehow. It is impacting a choice you're going to make. It might be impacting you physically. It might be impacting you mentally. You may be having a commitment issue. Something in your life is being impacted by a belief that you have that isn't true. And so I've given you examples of how physically we can be impacted. And why wouldn't that apply to our mental health, right? And so going back to this idea now of being more in line with God, right? How were we made? If you believe we were made, right? And I'm going to read in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. I'm just going to read them for time. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let him rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Right? Now, what does that mean in his image? Does it mean we look like God? Is that what it means? Because I don't think God has a physical form other than Jesus, right? So I don't think it means we look like God. I think what it means is we were built to think like God, to behave like God, right? And that all happens up here, right? So I think there's something to Dr. Jennings' theory that if we're made in God's image, that means we were designed to work a certain way, like God. And if we're not doing that, well, guess what? We're off the track, right? Take a train off the track and see how far it gets. Right? It's going to be a bumpy ride. And I think that's really how our brains are ever since the fall of Adam and Eve, which we'll talk about, tomorrow and the next night. So, it just goes back to if I design something to work a certain way and it doesn't, it's not functioning properly, right? The thing I'm going to look for is what's in the environment, right? Is there oil in the engine? Did I put diesel instead of gasoline in it, right? I'm going to start looking for these things. And so let's take this a little further now and let's say, okay, if we believe that God loves, right, as most of us do, or maybe 1 in 4 of us do, but we also believe that he punishes and seeks vengeance, well, guess what? We're going to behave the same way. There's another. Well, let me wait. I'm going to back up a little bit because I'm going to get to that in just a second. I'm going to read you a quote real quick from one of the books I studied pretty well. Dr. Jennings. It's called "Could It Be This Simple? A Biblical Model for Healing the Mind." And he says the law of worship, also known as modeling, is basically it's where people kind of mimic what they worship, essentially, because of it we become like whatever we admire or worship, whatever we idolize, whether it be a person, God, idea, idol, we become more like it. We adapt ourselves to whatever we focus on. If we focus on self, we become more self-centered. As we train the mind to focus on the destructive, infecting element in our mind, its dangerous power strengthens. So all of you are aware of these people that kind of worship celebrities, right? And they'll do things like get plastic surgery to look like them. They'll start talking like them. And I used to think that was an act, but I think really, and psychology has proven this. Those people start to really try to believe they're those people, right? They're worshiping these celebrities. They're modeling themselves after these celebrities, right? And much the same way that Christians model themselves after the God we worship, right? I read one time that humans actually naturally worship something. Like this was another scientific fact. Like this wasn't a church fact, right? These were scientists, right? They always like to discount what we say in church. So they said it in a scientific journal, but they said basically we're actually kind of designed to worship things, right? Which goes right along with what we're talking about. And so if, as Christians, we're worshiping God, but we believe God is what? Benevolent and loving, but he says, I'll give you everything you want. I'll love you to the end of time. But if you don't listen to me, I'm going to throw you in a pit of hell and watch you burn for all eternity and torture you, right? Which is what many people believe about God, including very well-meaning Christians, maybe some in here right now, right? And I'm here to tell you that's a lie. That's a lie. But because Christians are operating under that lie very frequently, right? Many Christians believe this. It is the predominant view in Christianity, you would even say, right? If you believe that, guess how you're going to behave? Are you going to treat your children that way? Are you going to behave like a person who coerces other people to get what they want? Who says, I can give you this, but if not, I'm going to smack you in the forehead, right? I mean, how do we behave, right? And so now we're going back to this thing. Let's revisit this issue I talked about when we were talking about statistics. Well, hey, let me back up one more second. Let me read this quote again from the book, says, why is knowing the truth about God so critical? And what impact does it have on the brain? God created us in his image with the ability to adapt and change based on our choices and experiences. When we believe lies about God, those false beliefs actually damage us, change our neural circuits, and warp our minds and characters. So he's doing geek speak here because he's a doctor. Conversely, when we receive the truth, we are also changed, conformed back into the image of God through the working of his Spirit. Brain science has given us some insights into the amazing pathways through which our thoughts actually change our brains, right? So he's agreeing, basically saying, if you think the wrong thing's going to happen. If you think the right thing's going to happen. So let's go back now to this thing that we talked about, Christians being viewed poorly, right? Something like 84%, 87% thought Christians were judgmental, right? Or, let's see. They thought we were judgmental, hypocritical, old-fashioned, right? And these were like in the 75-80% range. People believe this about us. And so the question I have is why? Why? If you're here tonight to learn about God, and that's what you believe, that's going to be your question. Why? Why are they judgmental, right? Why are they? Because you might already have that view in your mind, right? And so my thought, well, because we do behave poorly, right? If people see you a certain way, guess what? That's the way you are, whether you like it or not, right? You may want to think you're something else, but if I survey 10 people and they all say you're mean, right? And the only one that says you're nice is your mom, guess what? You're probably not nice, right? And so let's look at some of the statistics. Again, I like numbers. Domestic violence against women. In Christian homes, one survey put it at about 33%. So that's about a third of Christian homes where the woman has had some type of domestic violence committed against her. In other non-Christian homes, so these are homes that identified themselves as non-Christian, depending on the source, there was two sources. It was either 22% or 37%, right? So it falls right in line with that number. Here was the shocking one. You Christian ladies, you're tough. Against men, right? Christian men, the rate was 20%. 20% of Christian men had suffered or felt some type of domestic violence in their home, according to these surveyed. Non-Christian homes, it was between 7% and 18%, depending again on the source, right? So it could be significantly less, right? Depending on how accurate that source was. That's astonishing, right? That Christians would behave that way. Aren't we supposed to have the love of Christ, right? Pornography. 2/3 of Christian men watch pornography monthly, right? And that's basically right on par with secular rates, right? Non-Christian folks. Criminal behavior. Here's another study. I just took a quote from it. I'll read it. Citing 4 different studies, Zuckerman states, murder rates are actually lower in more secular nations and higher in more religious nations where belief in God is widespread. He also states, of the top 50 safest cities in the world, nearly all are in relatively non-religious countries. Now, sometimes I kind of, I doubt the validity of some of these studies because I think people generally have an agenda. But I would say that living in a Christian city doesn't necessarily make you safer. I don't know that it makes you less safe, as this study shows, but who knows, right? Divorce, right? One study had them basically about the same. Christian, non-Christian, divorce was about the same, right? And so the question I have is, now knowing, we can admit freely that we as Christians are no better than the rest of the world, right? We don't behave any better, right? And maybe the reason we're viewed so negatively is because we like to think we do, right? But we should behave better. We should be better, right? And I ask you, if you're here tonight, do you have an addiction? Do you have a prejudice? Do you have a lack of faith, right? Have you ever been hurt and wondered, where is God? What is he doing? Why didn't he intervene? Or worse, have you ever thought God was punishing you or someone you knew? Have you ever been frustrated with, confused by, or wrestled with love? But that he also, let me read that again. Have you ever been frustrated with, confused by, or wrestled with conflicting views about God? Were you ever taught that God is disobedient, or have you ever taught, that God is love, but that he also punishes and inflicts pain for disobedience, not to redeem and discipline, but to torture and destroy? Have you battled with fear of God? Have you considered the possibility that your view of God could be affecting your mental, physical, and relational health? I would say that's true for at least one person in here, if not more, right? And I know I've gone through that. I know I've gone through that personally. I've gone through that where I wanted to believe in God. I did, and I felt like I believed in God. But there were some things that I doubted because I was questioning exactly what we've been talking about. How could God love me but torture me if I don't listen to him, right? And so I ask tonight, does it sound like you? Does it sound like Christianity as a whole? Does this sound like some of the Christians you know? And because of this issue, I can say Christians have no power, right? The God most of us believe in isn't all that great. And so guess what? Neither are we. You know, and our view of God only makes some of these problems worse, right? It exacerbates these problems. The things that God should be conquering for us are actually getting worse, right? And the Bible predicts this condition. Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, again, I'm just going to read it. But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come, for men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable. What's the number one cause for divorce, right? What's cited? Irreconcilable differences. Malicious, gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. And here's the kicker. Here's what we're talking about here tonight. Holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Because most Christians, because of the way we believe in God, the God we're believing in, we're missing the power. We may have the form of godliness. I may have the cross. I may go to church. I may say all the right things. I may pray. But I don't have any of the power that I would get from God because I'm not believing in God. I'm believing in a false God, right? And so, catch that last bit again. Holding to a form of godliness, but denying its power. Who do you think he's talking about? Do you think he's talking about atheists and agnostics? Do you think he's talking about people that don't identify as Christians? He's talking about us, right? Who holds to the form of godliness, but doesn't have the power, right? We look like God, right? We try to present that facade, but we're lacking the power, right? Why are we losing ground instead of gaining ground? According to those statistics, we're losing ground, right? What's going on here? You know, the other issue stemming from this is Christians don't have salvation, right? And a lot of us would like to argue with that, and we like to believe we do. But let's read what Matthew has to say. Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 and 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me. Who is he talking about? Who would prophesy in his name? Who would cast out demons in his name? Who would perform miracles in his name if not someone who believes in God? And those are the people that are going to be turned away. Because why? I never knew you, he says. That's scary to me because I always thought I knew God. I always thought I knew God. And when I didn't understand something, I would kind of rely on my faith. I'd say, well, I just have faith in God, and that's the way it is, and that's the way I'll do it. But that's not what he wants. He wants us to know him. You see, we can't bury our head in faith. It's not sand. We can't just say, I don't understand, and bury our head, right? We can't do that because it'll lead us to this fate. We will be left at the door hearing those words, I never knew you, depart from me, because we didn't do our part to dig for the truth. And if we've been fooled into worshiping a false god, as I want to make the case of this week, Satan has done a great job of fooling us into worshiping not the God, but a version of him that is different enough to take us off the track, to warp our minds. And the last point I want to make here, it's not going to be a quick one, but I think you guys all know now that we are in a war. And the question is, not whether you want to be a part of the war, because you are. You are part of the war. Whether you want to be or not, whether you sit on your hands or whether you get up and fight, you are in this war. Because this war has a battlefield, not physically, right? This battlefield is in our minds, and you can't escape your mind. I'm going to read another verse here, 2 Corinthians chapter 10. If you guys want to turn to it, I'm going to spend some time on it. I'm just going to read it for time. So it's verses 1 through 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 6. Now I, Paul, myself urge you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who am meek when face to face with you, but bold toward you when absent. I thought that was interesting. I thought that was kind of a funny statement to make by Paul. And I can almost hear the Corinthians saying to Paul, oh, you're all cool with us, when you're here, Paul, but you're kind of Billy Bad Dude in your letters when you're writing, chewing us out, right? So why don't you say that to my face, Paul, right? And so it's kind of interesting to see that Paul's kind of addressing this, right? And Paul goes on to say, I ask that when I am present, I need not be bold with the confidence with which I propose to be courageous against some who regard us as if we walked according to the flesh. What is Paul saying here? He's saying, I don't got to be a tough guy, right? I'm not trying to fight you. I'm not trying to square up. I'm not trying to box you, right? Paul's saying, look, this isn't a physical fight. Don't stop trying to fight me, right? This isn't about my fists. It's not about bombs. It's not about guns. It's not about fists. This war can't be fought with those things. It's not of the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. Destruction of fortresses. Now he's talking about big weapons, right? He's not talking about fists and bullets. He's talking about nuclear, mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction, right? What are these fortresses? Right? What's a fortress? It's like a stronghold, right? It's something, it's like a city. It's protecting something, right? And so, what are these fortresses and where are the questions? Let's keep going. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Do you know what it means to speculate? I have a definition here because I like the dictionary, especially when I'm doing these things. It means to form a theory or conjecture about a subject without firm evidence. Speculate. Where would you speculate? How would you speculate? It's in your mind, right? He's destroying speculations. And these aren't just any thoughts, right? These are thoughts without firm evidence, right? These are thoughts that don't actually have any basis. This fortress Paul's trying to destroy is in our mind. And what does he do once he destroys this fortress? Right? What is he really trying to get to? The fortress is just in the way. He's trying to capture thoughts, right? And we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And we are ready to punish all disobedience, right? So he's trying to take these thoughts and do away with them. But here's the kicker. Here's the last piece. Whenever your obedience is complete. What is he saying? He's saying, once you get on the right page, once you decide that this is what you want me to do, I can fly my plane in there and drop these bunker-busting bombs. I can get rid of those fortresses for you. But I can't do it until you say it's okay. You know, what Paul's really saying is that the thoughts we have are important. And he's trying to make sure that you don't have any malicious thoughts in your mind. That's what he's warring against. And why is it that important? I think I made that point tonight, and I hope you all understand that having thoughts against God, speculations, things that aren't necessarily true against God, needs to be dealt with. You know, it doesn't matter what denomination you are. It doesn't matter which building you go to, whether it's this building or a different Seventh-day Adventist church or a Catholic church or a Baptist church. Claiming to be Christian but not knowing God's true character, that's what matters. Because that's what's going to get you into hot water. Right? In effect, when you do that, when you claim to be Christian but you don't know the true God, you're worshiping a false god. And so real quick, I want to finish off with the goals for the week, and I'm going to try to go through this fast. I want to help you understand the truth about God's character and his methods of love and settling this cosmic conflict. Trust rests on the revelation of evidence that he has given to demonstrate his trustworthiness. He's laid out the path. He's given us the evidence. We have to be willing to find it. This reestablished trust expels fear from our hearts, and we begin again to operate from motives of love rather than selfishness, fear, and guilt. Again, that's a quote from Dr. Jennings. Satan, who was the angel Lucifer, has been spreading lies about God for a long time. And the basis of those accusations, the basis of those lies, point to a flawed character in God. We're going to talk about this week. We're going to talk about that this week. And unfortunately, as I've hopefully convinced you tonight, many of those lies have affected the universe, including God's people, including Christians. And it's stunted the growth, the spiritual growth of many Christians, because a lot of us rely on blind faith to resolve our concerns, right? It's often ineffective, right? You don't feel better. You just bury your head and try to avoid it. And this is contrary to how God wants us to relate to him, right? He wants us to know him. You know, we read in Matthew 7:23, I did not know you, right? That means, well, you should have known me, right? He's trying to say, I need you to know me. Other people have logically concluded that the God depicted in these lies, the lies that Satan's been telling, cannot or should not be worshipped. Right? And so I'm just going to read real quick this little excerpt. I copied something from an atheist website. It says, this tale is inherently immoral. Adam and Eve are described as being without knowledge of the difference between right and wrong, and therefore are unable to make an informed judgment. Sounds kind of right, but not really, right, as you read this. The God Yahweh, knowing the choice that the ignorant couple would make, deliberately chose to tempt them by drawing their attention to the alluring tree that he had created. Instead of punishing the offenders, he decreed that all creation should suffer. The installation of propitiation through a blood sacrifice is typical of the bloodthirsty gods of most primitive beliefs. This vicarious sacrifice is the basis of the idea that the death of Jesus opens the way for the offloading of guilt, which is the primary doctrine of Christianity. This doesn't sound that different than the Christianity I grew up believing in. There's a few things I might have disagreed with, but for the most part, I think Christians would believe, that's kind of what I was taught, right? He's just saying it in a sarcastic manner, right? And he goes on to say, this doctrine opens the floodgate for transgression, then absolution, and a repetitive cycle, as shown by the statistics of criminal offenses by Roman Catholics. So he's picking on the Catholics, right? I would say the statistics are probably pretty similar with all Christians. And there's branches of Christianity that say, I don't even have to be repentant for my sins. All I really have to do is say I believe in Jesus, and everything I do after that doesn't matter. And so what this guy is saying, this is nonsense, right? This atheist website is basically laying out the story and saying it's nonsense. Well, I don't disagree. He's absolutely right. It's nonsense. That is not the God that we should be worshiping. That is the God that Satan has portrayed. And I want to make that point this week. That is the God that Satan has put before us. We have accepted that unknowingly. But we have to get to the truth. Simply being faithful isn't enough, right? We can't just be faithful. We can't just say, I believe in God. I know Satan's lying, but I'm just gonna believe God's good and everything's gonna work out. We can't do that, right? I never knew you is what he'll say. God must be accurately represented to the world so that all have an opportunity to accept or reject him in his true character. Right? It's not fair if we reject him without ever knowing him. Right? If I grow up and somebody's taught me a God that doesn't really exist, that I reject, whose fault is that? What chance did I have? There's many people in that boat, right? They've been taught a God that doesn't exist. Of course, they've rejected him, logically so. It doesn't make sense to worship that God. Excuse me. And so I want to expose some of these lies this week. I want to get to the true nature of God. I want to talk about punishment. I want to talk about forgiveness. I want to talk about trials. And I want to talk about the true nature of Christ's sacrifice. Why did he really die on that cross? Was it just as a blood sacrifice so that we could absolve ourselves of guilt? I don't believe that. I want to present to you a God you can trust, a loving God, a God you want to worship, right? Not one that you feel you obligated to worship for fear. A God that you'll allow in your life so that he can help you conquer those issues. A God who saves is who I want you to know this week. One more quote here. Sadly, far too many people fail to realize that the ultimate reason for pursuing truth is healing. Instead, throngs of people fear the truth. They fear that knowing the truth will cause pain, embarrassment, or loss of position, job, respect, health, relationship, or reputation. So they run from it. But we must learn to be truthful in all things, in all circumstances, in all relationships, for truth destroys lies and opens the life for healing. So the last thing I want to say, the absolute last thing I want to say tonight, the closing thought, is that we need to resolve ourselves to find the truth, or we'll face the consequences.